and his name will be called Mighty God, Everlasting Father. That's not in the Septuagint. If you go online now and look it up, it's not there. It just says, yes, wow is right.
I figured I'd start us off by, well, let's look at the Septuagint. So did the Septuagint that we know come before or after the New Testament? A lot of people assume that it came before the New Testament, and that the reason why that the text citing the Hebrew Bible, like we see in the Gospels or even Paul's letters, looks closer to the Septuagint because they are working from the Septuagint. But is that really the case?
I'll just begin because there's an elephant in the room. And that is, as it turns out, the Hebrew Bible was translated numerous times, both prior to the advent of Christianity and following it. Jerome, in his introduction to the book of Chronicles, writes about the tremendous variant translations in the Greek language. And the problem is they all called themselves the Septuagint. So as an analogy, we're familiar with the most famous English translation of the Bible, the King James, that was published in 1611. Now, subsequent to the King James Bible, there are hundreds of translations of the Bible into the English language. There were many before, but many very famous after. Imagine if subsequent to the King James Bible, imagine if every other English translation called themselves the King James because it's such a famous name. And after all, it has a stamp of the king on it. So that would create tremendous confusion. In fact, it does create a little confusion just to illustrate this, because people think when they look at a King James Bible today, the KJV, that they're actually looking at the 1611 King James, and they're not. The 1611 King James is written in Jacobean English. You can order it online. You could see it online, but it would be hard to read. The grammar's changed, the words change, and so on and so forth. So imagine if the NIV, a fairly recent English translation of the Bible, it's very popular, very readable, the New Revised Standard Version. Imagine if they all just called themselves the King James Version. So that is exactly what happened. So we're using this term Septuagint with a capital S, and of course, it's the worst kept secret that the term Septuagint refers to the 70 or 72 translators of the 5 books of Moses, which really scholars call the Proto-Septuagint. So everyone, it was a killer, didn't make a difference. Everyone was calling their book the Septuagint. Now, the original Septuagint of the 5 books of Moses, as you pointed out, Jacob, is lost. The Alexandrian Library was destroyed more than one time. And I write about this in my book. I actually can go to the 5 books of Moses Septuagint, because we have the Talmud, which has quotes on 13 quotes, and it's been changed completely. So therefore, there are tens of Septuagints running around, and this was a very big complaint, both by Jerome, the primary translator of the Vulgate, and in fact, in the preface to the King James 1611, the translators write, this is a tremendous problem that the Septuagint, there's just so many versions. So we're going to be using the word Septuagint a lot in this program, but it doesn't mean Septuagint. It means a Greek translation that certainly was produced prior to the advent of Christianity in the 1st century BC, of course. And there were many Septuagints that were produced after the advent of Christianity. What I think people are taught in school is that, of course, the writers of the Christian Bible were relying on the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew Bible. But this is not correct. What was happening is the Christian Bible was methodically, deliberately altering the Hebrew Bible in order to make it appear Christological. And then subsequently, Greek translations were fashioned or edited to comport to those corruptions. Origen would be the most dominant force. And as I said, Jerome lists out the contributing editors to different Septuagints. And Jerome was only one of 2 church fathers that was completely fluent in both Greek and Hebrew. Hebrew. And he said that he can't, although originally he was going to create a Latin translation on behalf of the Pope in Latin from the Greek. He said that's not possible. He's going to the original Hebrew. In fact, he lived here in Israel. He died in Bethlehem, I think, in 420. So he said there's so many Greek versions out there, it's all silly. So there were, of course, ancient. In fact, we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have Greek texts, and they're correctly identified as G texts, not Septuagint. So there's just all these Greek translations, and people generically call them Septuagint, and this is extremely misleading.
Wow. Well, they're all trying to glom on to the legend of the Septuagint and the miraculous, simultaneous, exact translation. So they're all trying to glom onto that tradition, that miraculous tradition. But you took one of my points right out of my mouth. Don't we have Greek versions from the Dead Sea Scrolls? And, and it's certainly got to be the case, Jacob, that Christians are going to use, if there's an existing Greek translation, they're going to use the one that's most friendly to them. But I also think that Origen himself might have been responsible for some of the Christian-friendly Greek versions of Hebrew literature. I think those are all true facts.
Yeah, because the implication here is that Origen is basically the creator of the Septuagint, or the Hexapla,
Right.
As it's called. That's the text that Origen put together, and this would mean that the Septuagint we know came from the 3rd century of the Common Era.
Right. So Origen's the other church. We will call him a church father or a church doctor. Certainly, I think one of the most brilliant Christian thinkers in history, 3rd century. He was absolutely fluent in Hebrew and a genius. He's the one that really is most responsible for the version of Septuagint we have today. Incidentally, there are relics. There are relics of earlier Greek translations in the current Septuagint. I'll say them; they'll surprise you. Example: Isaiah 9:6, 5 and 6, depending on which Bible, where it is, a child will be born to us, and his name will be called Wonderful Advisor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. You know that segment? We all know it, right? And Christians say there's the deity of Christ in the book of Isaiah. Do you know that in a Septuagint, our version of the Septuagint doesn't appear there at all? So it's interesting. So, yeah, I'm not kidding. If you go look it up right now, it's not in there. It cut it out. So obviously, the edition we have is relying on a whole variety of Greek translations that were edited, but it's not perfect. Well, the genealogy in Genesis 5 is way, way off. I would have Methuselah swimming in the Great Flood. So there's relics of all this stuff in our version of the Septuagint that you can buy on Amazon.
I have a question.
Is there any kind of variorum edition that has all these different renderings?
Yeah, there are. You can get them. I mean, they're published where you have different versions of it, including, as James said, the Greek translations we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. See, Emmanuel Tov was honest. I mean, he was a real scholar. It's the real deal. So he called them G texts. He didn't call them. They're not Septuagints at all. And there are many variants. But this goes to prove the Christians will go, well, the Septuagint is older than the Masoretic text, which is a very silly thing, because we have the Hebrew text not only in Aleppo but in the Talmud. Talmud quotes virtually all of it. But yeah, of course, they have parallel texts that are there. But clearly you had Aquila, who does a literal Greek translation, not very readable, more like an American standard. But of course, the church would come to favor the Greek Septuagint, that's in quotation marks, Septuagint, that most supports, that best bolsters the Christian corruptions in the Hebrew Bible, so that in Psalm 22:16 it would say they pierced in the Greek, and so on, and all this stuff is all mapped out. But they made mistakes, and sometimes, as I pointed out, a massive one is Isaiah 9 verse 6. The words, and his name will be called, Mighty God, Everlasting Father. That's not in the Septuagint. If you go online now and look it up, it's not there. It just says Yes, wow is right. So I want you to know what it's incredible. I tell you now, if you're watching this show, go online. It's free online, and look it up, and you'll see that it isn't there. And why isn't it there? Because somebody took it out from another Greek translation, and it could have been a Jew who it could have been. I don't know. I have no clue. There's no way for me to know. But whatever it is, that passage has been corrupted, but in the other way, in an anti-Christian way. You follow this? This is mind-blowing. And I encourage you, the viewer, open a browser and look it up. You see it's not there. So you have a corruption that's an anti-Christian corruption that somehow its relic remains in the Septuagint that we get on Amazon today. So it goes both ways, because it was obviously assembled from many pre-existent, again, Septuagints, and this is, again, generic when we're using this term Septuagint. The legend of the letter Aristes that James pointed out, and the Talmud and Josephus all talk about this miraculous translation. There's a joke that goes with this. You know, the miracle is that 72 learned Jews were each placed in a separate room and given the task of rendering the Pentateuch, and miraculously all their translations were identical. But the joke is that if you put them all in the same room, it would be mind-blowing that they would produce one that was the same. But as it turns out, it's really so. It's a hodgepodge of corruption. Some of them, as I say, Genesis 6, we have the genealogy of Adam, very famous. The numbers are way, way off. So, Origen didn't sift through this carefully enough.
I have a question for both Bob and the rabbi. What about Paul's use? Can we distinguish between Paul's use of Hebrew literature in a Greek translation and or in Hebrew? Can we parse that out so that we know that Paul, as early as Paul, Christians were using, at least in part, a Greek version, and especially non-Torah Hebrew literature in a Greek version? Or can we figure that out?
In the time that Paul was writing his letters in the 50s, who in Corinth was literate, let alone had access to a Hebrew Bible? I mean, so did Paul really have to concern himself that people would look up his letter to Corinth in 1 Corinthians or whatever, any of these letters? When he's writing this stuff, he had no worry that someone was going to cross-check him. You know what it meant in the first century to even be able to read Hebrew? I mean, how do you even get your hands on a Bible? It had to be written by hand, probably on parchment. So Paul didn't have to worry about these things. He could say whatever he wants. He didn't have to be concerned. Matthew, on the other hand, who was writing with a Jewish audience in mind, got himself in a lot of trouble because Jews went, hang on, Matthew, not so fast. But Paul's audience, who of them would be able to read Hebrew?
This reminds me of 1 Corinthians 15, where he says that he was seen resurrected by over 500 brethren, most of whom are still alive, though a few kick the bucket. And apologists always say, aha, you see, he wasn't afraid of being debunked. He knew he wouldn't be. Well, he doesn't even give you any names. Would he expect these people in Corinth to book a flight to Palestine to say, anybody here seen the risen Jesus? There's no way they could check this out. It's just take it from me. It's pseudo documentation. And that's right. I even think that I've said this too many times, I suppose, but the idea that Paul would have gained any ground with the big news among Gentiles that, hey, the rightful heir of David has come. Isn't that great? You can imagine the Gentile audience saying, the what? The who? It'd be like going around saying, oh man, I can't believe it. The rightful successor to the throne of Liechtenstein has been determined. What? How could this attract anybody?
Well, it's clear that the gospel misquote using a bad version of the Septuagint, at least, will misquote prophets, virgin versus young woman. But I'm wondering if we have any kind of similar evidence within the letters of Paul, as far as you know, Dr. Bob.
Of misquoting stuff on purpose?
That we can see in a later Septuagint, say.
I wouldn't be able to say. I know what he does is to pluck things out of context, like in Romans, this cento of quotations about how all have sinned. That's not what it's talking about. This guy who's undergoing persecution is saying, everybody I turn to is a rat. I don't understand it. He's not making the doctrine of hamartology or something. And how does he know? I think even some of Origin, where people say he's allegorizing scripture, I think he's just making literary allusions. He's not necessarily saying, that's a case of over-interpreting. But there's one difference that might be relevant here. I've read that Hebrews is its Bible quotations are much closer to, I guess, the most widely known version of the Septuagint, so much so that those who do textual criticism, trying to get to the original Septuagint, which kind of sounds impossible from what we've said here, that people take Hebrews as a textual witness. That's kind of circular in its own right, that it's closest to whatever version. I never even knew there were. I knew there were other Jewish Greek translations of the Hebrew, but I had no idea about this very important thing about it. They just call them all the Septuagint. That really is mind blowing to me.
I can easily think of an example from the book of Hebrews, which is backed up by the Septuagint. So it's very famous, Hebrews chapter 10. Here, the author is advancing the notion that the entire animal sacrificial system was only a shadow of Christ's body. After all, how could the blood of bulls and goats atone for sin? And then this author, who the church came to believe was Paul, quotes, and I use that word in quotation marks, quotes Psalm 40, verse 6, where it says in Hebrews 10:5, sacrifices and offerings thou does not want, but a body you have prepared for me. A body you have prepared for me. Burnt offerings, sin offerings, you have not required. So that's what the reading in Hebrews 10:5 and 6. And again, the context is very important, that really the whole sacrificial system is really a shadow of Christ. And that's very Pauline. There's no one here who has a doubt that no one here thinks that Paul actually authored the book of Hebrews, but Hebrews is Pauline. So, and that idea of a shadow. But if we go back to Psalm chapter 40, verse 6 through 8, it doesn't say that in the original Hebrew. It says, sacrifice and offering you didn't desire, but oznayim karisoli, my ears you have opened for me, burnt offering and sin offerings you have not required. Oznayim means ears. And to answer your question, here's the perfect example. Now go to the Septuagint. What do you think the Septuagint going to do? What do you think Origen did? So therefore, in Psalm 40, verse 6, in the Septuagint, it says, a body are prepared for me, in order to comport with Hebrews 10:5, and despite the fact that in Hebrew, in the original Hebrew, it says, my ears you have opened me. There's such a rudimentary Hebrew word, oznayim, ears, open for me. So there's a mind-blowing example. And in fact, just to be sure that I'm quoting this in context, in Hebrews 10 further says in verse 18 that now that Christ died, that there is no longer a need for sacrifices any longer. And Christians don't know what to do with the third temple sacrificial system. This is a big problem for them. So here you have a perfect example, Jacob, of the Christian Bible, a Pauline text, completely misquoting the Hebrew text, and then the Septuagint coming in with bleach and a rag, like what's his name from Breaking Bad, the guy who's the fixer, right? And he comes in and he wipes down all the fingerprints. That's the role of the Septuagint.
The original ears thou hast dug for me or opened. And I have come to do thy will, O God. In other words, I'm ready to hear. Speak, Lord, for thy servant speaketh. That makes plenty of sense. Where's the body thing?
The context of King David, what would inspire him to write that? So that takes us back to King David's life. He was far from perfect. And in a juridical parable that he receives from the prophet Nathan, he says, I've sinned before the Lord, very famous. And Nathan said, God forgave you. So God forgives David, and David didn't bring any sacrifices. So throughout the book of Psalms, he's going to speak about that I sinned, and God does not want a sacrifice. He wants a broken and contrite heart, Psalm 51. So this fits thematically into King David's own life. God forgave him for an unimaginable crime that he committed in 2 Samuel chapter 12. And God forgave him. So King David says, no, my ears you have opened for me. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you have not required, which doesn't make sense in a Christian view. You don't need blood. So this is very critical. This is not a mistake. We are not being pedantic here. This is a mind-blowing, very deliberate, pernicious, malevolent attempt to alter the Hebrew scriptures and using the Septuagint.
Well, it's much more complicated than any Christian scholar of any stripe, known to me, thinks it is. I mean, it's so oversimplified, even in scholarly discussions. Oh, yeah, there was the Greek Septuagint, and that's the reference we ought to use. This really throws all of that into a cocked hat, as they say. It's you have to really redefine the whole game.
I actually have a chapter on this in Let's Get Biblical. I'm not trying to sell books, but I have a whole chapter, and what I did is the forensics on this. So really we have many sources for the ancient Septuagint, many sources for it. Josephus talks about it. It's all over the place. That's no question. We have the mythical letter of Aristide, whatever. We have a lot of sources. But we have one source which actually quotes 13 passages from the Proto-Septuagint, which is really the proper term to refer back to what is not extant, which is the original Septuagint, which we don't have anymore. It's lost completely. But the Talmud actually identifies 13. It's in Tractate Megillah on page 9, where the Talmud gives 9 of 13 passages and how they translate it and why they translate in this unique way. It's not germane of why they translate it in a certain way. They didn't want to offend the queen, whatever reason. It's not important. What did I do? Now, I can't be the first guy who ever did this. Someone else must have done it. I haven't seen it anywhere. But what I did was I said, okay, I have 13 passages quoted in the Talmud. Let me go to a Septuagint, and see, of the 13, are they any of them still in the current Septuagint of the 5 books of Moses? And the answer is 2 are, and 11 are gone, which means if I could extrapolate from that, there's only 2 out of 13, less than 10%, less than 10% remain. So therefore, we could see even from our only source from the ancient world, the Talmud, that the Septuagint of the 5 books of Moses, very little of it resembles what it was.
That's pretty disturbing from a scriptural authority standpoint, I should think. Boy.
Yeah, we could just simply have Christians in the New Testament lying about what the text says, or possibly we could have at least some alternate Greek texts that Christians themselves used or prepared or created themselves that are different from what late. I mean, the point being made here is that the use of the term Septuagint is awfully fast and loose. We've got
Yeah.
to we've got to back up and say, well, which Greek translation of which version, and we really don't know. So that's a giant question mark, isn't it?
In the preface, no one reads it. I don't know what drew me to read it, but there is a preface to the KJV that was written collectively by the 47 translators back in the early 17th century. They write about this. They write about there's so many versions. They had so many Greek versions available to them because they're explaining why they ultimately had to rely on the Hebrew. Now, we all know that they're relying on Tyndale for a good part of it, but we all know that. That's the worst kept secret. But they point out that they had access to so many Greek translations, so-called Septuagint, therefore it's completely unreliable. And believe me, they were not a fan of Rabbi Tovia Singer, but they didn't love me. They were all of them are members of the Church of England in very good standing, and men, no women among them. So they admit this issue, but I think, I'll tell you a funny thing. I'll say this to both of you. You'll appreciate this, all of you. I sit down. I have a lot of friends who are Greek scholars, including yourselves, who are New Testament scholars. And privately, the number one question I'm asked by people who we all know, I sit with them, we talk, we do things together. They ask me, so what do you think of Paul really? Like, what do you think of Jesus really? Like, do you think he was a really bad guy? So that's the question that comes up when I'm lecturing or whatever. I don't have a favorable view of Paul, and I don't have a favorable view of Jesus. Now, I can't be sure about Jesus because who has access to that? But I don't think something so evil could have come out of something good. Just in my view, that they're shaken up by. So I think I'm going to just put this out there. I've never said this, but I think in the academic world, there's kind of a consensus that Jesus was a nice Jewish fellow, a preacher, who was, kind of maybe the first Reform rabbi, who was deeply misunderstood. And eventually all the mythology that surrounded is a later development. And after all, look at the Q source, look at the Gospel of Thomas, look at these ancient texts that are just sayings. So obviously that must be the most ancient iteration of what the historical Jesus would be like. So, this is just convention. People don't question this. In the humanities, it's very hard. I mean, James, you've done that where you've pushed back at orthodoxy within the academic world. And Bob has pushed back at orthodoxy. I'm not talking about the fundamentalist world. Forget that. I'm talking about, Yale Divinity. And they're not fundamentalists. So both of you, scholars, have both pushed back at the orthodoxy because this is the humanities and things swing in very different directions and they change generationally. Like today, everyone's defending that the original Josephus, some relic of Testimonium Flavium, it was written by Josephus, right? But 50 years ago, it was the reverse. 50 years ago, 75% of scholars thought that it was a complete invention, and 25%. So this is the humanities, and like a pendulum, it swings every 50 years. There's just views change.
Well, one thing I do know is that Paul will turn whatever version of Hebrew scriptures he's using, he will, for his own purposes, take it out of context, turn it upside down on its head to make his own point. So Paul's misuse and obviously the agenda behind his misuse of Hebrew scriptures is apparent to me, whatever version Paul was using of Hebrew scriptures. That's just too clear, and too many times he does that.
I like Gershom Sholom's discussion of this on the Kabbalah and its meaning. He says, like many mystics throughout history, Paul had some sort of overcoming religious experience that made him think in different categories. but he couldn't just turn his back on his heritage. And he thought, now they must have known what I now know. And in light of this, I see different things in Scripture, and that isn't necessarily manipulation consciously, as if he were actually trying to take things out of context to cheat somebody or mislead them, but he just couldn't help seeing it in a different way. And I've known many people, as I'm sure we all have, who cannot help using the Bible as a mirror. And as an old friend of mine once said in seminary, it's like, it's not the Bible said it. I believe it, that settles it. Rather, it's I said it, the Bible believes it, that settles it. And it becomes a
Right.
ventriloquist dummy. And they're not lying, they're just overtaken by their experience.
Their own perspective. I mean, scholars since Albert Schweitzer have been saying that people will create Jesus in their own image.
Right.
That's the way it goes. I mean, if you're a Marxist, you'll have a Marxist Jesus. If you're an existentialist, you have an existentialist Jesus, and so forth. Yeah.
So let me take a shot at this. I think I would like to take what both of you said and take it to the next step. I think we don't want to believe that Paul was a malevolent shyster, right? But in fact, the case could easily be made that he was a Joseph Smith character, and he was not mistaken, just like none of us here believe that on September 21st, 1823, that Joseph Smith thought he encountered the angel Moroni in upstate New York. None of us believe that he had a non-vertical experience. We all know he was a scam artist. So we wouldn't take Gershon's approach with Joseph Smith. And it's very clear that Paul's enemies, and there are many things we can't be sure about in the New Testament. One thing to be very clear, everyone hated him. We know that because in the Christian Bible. That means that means the most rigorous criteria is that of embarrassment. We all know that, right? So there's no way that Paul, who couldn't get along with Barnabas, which he should have. Barnabas, after all, introduced him to Jerusalem Church. John Mark, his cousin, they wouldn't travel with him. He was telling Peter off to his face. There's no way in the world that could have been invented. When Paul screams at the churches in Asia Minor, "Who bewitched you, foolish Galatians," that others had come to his church, that has to be historical, has to be. Why would you invent that? And we all know that 2 Peter is trying to cover this up and trying to say we're all on the same page. And the book of Acts is trying to cover up something that's rather embarrassing. So the case is, it's a very easy case to be made that Paul was in fact a Joseph Smith figure who was a complete scam artist. And the reason we could say this with certainty is that his errors are not errors of mistakes or misapprehension, or he's using some, as an example, what I think is a mistake. I just want easy example, Matthew 23. Verse 35, where the author, there's a Q source, that the Jews are responsible for the innocent blood of Abel to all the way to Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. Okay? So as it turns out, that's a mistake. It's the wrong Zechariah. The guy who's murdered was a different fellow. But there's no theological reason why Matthew would have made that mistake. And in fact, Luke corrects that. It just says Zechariah in Luke, but leaves out the son of Berechiah. It's very clear it's just a mistake. Or the 75 souls went down to Egypt in Acts 7. So that's examples of somebody made a mistake. But when Paul says that in Romans chapter 11, verse 26, that a Redeemer will come to Zion and he will turn the hearts of Jacob back to God, that's a complete corruption, and it's thoroughly Pauline. That means you have to always ask the question, is there incentive here? Well, with Paul, nobody can repent. In Paul's view, everyone's a sinner, and no one could acquire salvation through his own acts, because he just told us in in Romans chapter 3 that no one wants the truth, misquoting Psalm chapter 14. So therefore, that means how can we know then? How can we know if something is nefarious or not? Well, it's very easy. When Paul in Romans 11:26 misquotes Isaiah 59 verse 20 in order to comport with Pauline theology, because the text says that the Redeemer, that a Redeemer will come to Zion to those who repent. So they're repenting, but in Paul's view, you can't repent and bring about your own salvation. So Paul changes that. That's completely malevolent. That's a complete corruption. That's not some mystical view. I get it why people want to, play the guitar around the campfire and have incense and la 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 and hang out in Sedona, Arizona and enjoy the vortex near the Grand Canyon and smoke something that's somewhat legal in recent years. Go ahead, do that if you want to. But if you go back to the text, you could see the fingerprints are all over the place. And to prove this point, everybody hated Paul because the New Testament admits it. There's no reason why something so embarrassing would ever be in a text unless it was historical. And just one other point, you see that Paul couldn't stand hypocrisy and lying, and that's exactly what he charges Peter with in Galatians when he says in Antioch he told Peter that he's a hypocrite to his face. Why did it bother Paul so much? That has to be historical. It bothered him because Peter was essentially doing what Paul always does.
Well, in fact, Paul himself, who knows what he actually wrote and what somebody else wrote, speaking of honesty or dishonesty. But when he says in 1 Corinthians, like, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. He says, when I'm among those who keep the law, I keep the law. But when I'm with those who don't, I don't bother because I don't want to offend anybody. I want to win everybody.
Yeah.
Isn't that
not a hypocrite like Kephas?
Right. But that's exactly what he charged Peter with. He said to the Jew, I come as a Jew.
That's exactly what he's doing.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's so obvious that we are looking at a Joseph Smith character. I get it why it's this, in a liberal Episcopalian, St. John the Divine in Manhattan, they want to find a way around it. Go ahead, knock yourself out. But it's not consistent with the text. The text is that Paul was very much a Joseph Smith character.
So back to Jacob's point, if Paul seems to be misquoting Hebrew literature, we don't know whether he's relying on some Greek version or not, or just making it up himself. Or whoever is writing whichever particular Pauline letter. And then just another point to make the Joseph Smith comparison. Of course, the first part of Galatians, Paul makes a big deal about saying, what I'm teaching you, I got from my own vision. And, I hate to be a skeptic, but when someone tells me I've had my own personal revelation, and this is where I'm getting the doctrine I'm teaching you, it is very Joseph Smith-like. And I think our suspicion hackles should be up. If you get that point.
Now, if someone screams constantly, I'm not a liar.
Believe me, I'm not lying.
I'm not lying. Believe me. I was circumcised in the 8th day. Really, you have a great memory. Come on. What do you, why does that come up? In what CV does it? I just want to say one other thing. So I'm in Israel right now. I happen to be in a bomb shelter, just because that's where the studio is, not because I'm, but just as a point, if you went into a synagogue in Israel, anywhere, unless it was like for people who are American visitors, it's all Hebrew. That means, could you only imagine that a rabbi in Israel is using an English translation? It would be inconceivable. So the only thing that you would recognize if you don't read any Hebrew at all is the page number in Israel. So if you're a Tana, if you're a student of Gamaliel, if you're anything in that world, you're in the contributing author to the Mishnah, in what universe are you using a Greek translation? And he's saying, I'm not just a Pharisee, I was the smartest kid in the class. Really? Why are you using a Greek translation? That's insane. The Greek translations were produced for a Hellenized Jewish community, not for a Pharisaic community that's steeped in the law and was more zealous for law than all of my peers. Philippians 3, Galatians 1 and 2. It's completely silly that he would be using a Greek. Why would he use a Greek translation?
I really like Chaim Maccabee's book, Paul and Hellenism. And he says, wait a minute, all the stuff about him studying under Gamaliel and so on, he doesn't handle, assuming Paul wrote it, and Maccabee was pretty conservative on things like that. He said Paul's handling of scripture is not like the rabbis, it's more like the Gnostics. And it does seem to me it's more like that. Plus, obvious mystery religion rub-offs. It just doesn't seem like what you would expect at all.
If you look up the word mystery in a concordance, and I'm not doing it right now, you basically will only find that term in Paul's letters. It's very unique to Paul. And Paul very frequently advanced the idea that this is the entire salvation plan of God is a complete mystery. And the only way you can know it is because I have a unique special revelation. And he says in 1 Corinthians 2, 7 and 8, he said that this mystery is only known to me. And he said, if the generation that crucified the Lord of glory had known this mystery, they would have never killed him. He says that openly, which is a complete Gnostic belief. Now, viewers there, Gnostic Christianity doesn't emerge to the 2nd century, but Gnosticism predates Christianity. This whole idea that there's a mystery, there's a secret, there's an occult information that a certain person has, that predates Christianity. Paul is operating that, let alone, why is he quoting Greek playwrights? What Pharisee would do that? Would be quoting Apollo? Why are you quoting idol worshippers? This would have been right at home in Athens and in Alexandria. This would not be at home in Jerusalem.
So for all we know, the Christians created their version of a Greek translation of Hebrew scripture to fit what the Gospels or Paul had said about it after the fact.
Right, and they can get away with it. And it's for this reason we all know that there are thousands of Christian schools in the United States where you are, and no Christian child is taught Hebrew. You could take Hebrew in college. That's not a problem. By then, you're completely brainwashed. Why? Is asked the question, why wasn't it important to the church to teach Hebrew to Christian children? After all, Christians believe that the Hebrew language is holy. Jews don't have a monopoly on that. They believe that God conveyed his sacred oracles in the Hebrew language. So why didn't Christians learn Hebrew? As Jewish, every Orthodox Jewish child learns Hebrew, could read Hebrew by the age of 8 years old, could read it like a newspaper. Every one of them. It's a very easy language, very simple. It's not a bloated language like English. So why didn't they? Because they had to create their own language. For the Western Church, it would be one in Latin, and in the Eastern Church, it would be the Greek translation. And that's what I mean. Why not the original Hebrew? And today, it's so interesting. There was a guy who almost became Pope, who's actually the bishop here in Jerusalem. And he actually is a Hebrew scholar. And everybody thought he's the biggest genius in the world because he's a professor of Hebrew. I forget his name. He has a funny name to him. But the point is, like, why are Christians not teaching children Hebrew? The reason is obvious. If you would read Hebrew, meaning read the Hebrew Bible in its original language, people would run out of the church. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל